So good evening and welcome to our 10th edition of Webster Speaks Dialogues on Race, Equity, and Inclusion. I'm your moderator, Earl McCoy Jr., Regional Recruitment Coordinator here at Webster University. Tonight's topic, my journey toward becoming an anti-racist. We want to remind you that you ask questions to our panel on Twitter using hashtag Webster Speaks, or send me an email at EARLMCCOY24@webster.edu. We'll get to as many questions as we can during our live conversation. And now here's our host, Webster University's Chief Diversity Officer, Vincent C. Flewellen.
Thanks, Earl, and welcome to our audience. I'd also like to thank the donors who made contributions during the registration process to support our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts at Webster University. Tonight's show has a distinct perspective. Previously, this program has featured Black activists and their contributions, solutions, and strategies towards social justice and equality. But tonight, we're taking a bit of a different approach, discussing ways in which white people can be advocates for people of color. We have assembled a panel of 4 white St. Louis area social justice activists. We have the Reverend Wendy Bruner. She's pastor of Peace United Church of Christ in Webster Groves. Rob Good, he is an adjunct professor at the University of Missouri at St. Louis and member of the Witnessing Whiteness facilitation team. Jackson Hotaling, he is a volunteer with Faith for the Sake of All. And Hannah Verity, she is a Witnessing Whiteness 2019 Webster University participant and a director of Webster's Global Program Development Office. Welcome and thanks for joining us. So tell us, each of you, in a nutshell, about your journey to becoming an anti-racist. We can go into a little bit more details later, but at this point, what was your starting point? And Pastor Bruner, we'll start with you and then we'll just proceed alphabetically.
Thank you, Vincent, for that question. So I grew up in Saskatchewan, Canada, and had very little experience with people who did not look like me. So when I first went, I went to Atlanta in 1989 as a volunteer with the church. And during that time, I was very lucky to participate in a group called People's Institute out of New Orleans. And we did a weekend-long workshop on, it was called Undoing Racism, and I believe that they're still active. It was my first time really to start to sit with people and have conversations about our experiences and how they were different. And that really got me started thinking about systems, right? And how they're broken and structures and how they treat people differently. And so that was the beginning part for me.
Thank you. Rob?
Yeah, I guess, when I got involved in a serious way, it was when I started as a young educator. And some of it, looking out at my school where I taught and seeing the disparities and the inequities in the school. But I was kind of involved in an intellectual way and thinking about how can we get, make some difference in the culture of the school. What really made the difference was an interaction with my teaching partner. So I got partnered with a woman of color who was my mentor and my guide, the person I learned everything I needed to know about teaching. And we were working for about 2 years together in a program for quote unquote at-risk students. That was a terrible term that they used at the time. And, the principals, who were all white, only one female, all males, would come to me and say, oh, we need you to move your classroom here. We need to show up for pictures here. And I would share this I would share this information with my teaching partner. And it was 2 years into it of doing this when she looked at me and she said, Rob, every time you get information and I don't, I die a little. And it just came crashing down, and that moment that I was, I'd had this intellectual understanding of equity and racism and things like that, but my collusion and my complicity with it and the pain that I had contributed to a person that I loved really made me sort of shift gears and start getting involved with NCCJ, St. Louis, the Dismantling Racism Institute, sort of changed my trajectory.
Thank you. Jackson.
Yeah, for me, I grew up right here in Webster Groves, Missouri. I moved there when I was 5. I don't know who my nearest non-white neighbor is. I don't know, I've had throughout most of my time up through high school, almost all white teachers. That was my experience. I went to church and I was in Boy Scouts, and those are also both predominantly white spaces as well. So I went to a liberal arts college in Ohio. Also, a lot of white people, of course, but there were a lot of international students there, and I started getting more involved in international relations and had a lot of friends from foreign countries. So that opened the door for more conversation that I just never was exposed to while I was growing up in Webster Groves. So that next summer, I was back in St. Louis. I was working in a factory on Hanley, and these are all, super, super blue collar workers, and clock in. And this is when Michael Brown was killed. Starting to ask more questions, and then hearing that other dialogue just totally kind of made me realize that I want to go in a different trajectory. So that was a turning point, I think. I was getting more involved throughout university, and living abroad finally helped me to actually see and experience personally a lot more that I wouldn't have seen in Webster.
Thanks, Jackson. Hannah?
Yeah, so for me, I think I had been on I don't know the starting point of my journey, but had been on a journey, grew up in St. Louis, understood that racism existed, saw the segregation in St. Louis and the discrepancies, in the education system between white communities and Black and Brown communities. And had already started to do some work on exploring my own biases and wanting to, be a part of change. And, but really a point of activation for me was August of 2014 and the killing of Mike Brown and the Ferguson uprising that happened after that, and just really started to show up at some of those demonstrations and protests, and started to be a part of that. After Mike Brown was killed in August, there was another Black man, Jimmy Powell, killed at the end of August in the city of St. Louis. And then in October, Vondret Meyer was killed by an off-duty police officer who was doing private security. And I lived about 5 blocks from where that happened. So that even more so struck home with me. And as I began to engage in the movement, and it really opened my eyes to looking at things that I hadn't looked at, to looking at things in a different way. And part of that was witnessing the way that the police response was to the protests, particularly the Black activists, seeing then the way that the media portrayed the protests, and knowing what really was happening on ground, but then seeing what was being presented to the public. And then seeing and feeling some of the pushback that I got in my own world, in my personal world, for showing up and protesting. And I would say the main thing that really started to shift my mindset to looking at more of systemic racism and looking at systems and how to dismantle them was really through that time period. I just learned so much from Black activists on the ground, and hearing their experiences and learning from them, their perspectives, really opened my eyes.
Thank you all. So it's interesting to hear each of your, onboarding, so to speak, the ways in which I often talk about it as a highway, right? So you're coming up this on-ramp, right? And hearing how you got involved into this. And so I'm curious to know, I think often there's a difference between being non-racist, right? And you hear folks say, I'm not racist, right? Versus being an anti-racist. And we were very intentional about this idea about anti-racist. And so I'm wondering, of course, there still are many white folks out there who don't necessarily know the distinction between the two. And I'm wondering how you all are able to, in your personal world as well as in your professional worlds, help to kind of inform and educate between those two distinctions of being a non-racist and being anti-racist.
So can anyone jump in? So I would actually say that I don't believe that as a white person, there is such a thing as a non-racist. I would say that we, as a system that was built on white supremacy, that we, as white people, are benefiting from the systems that we live in, and that we are participating in and complicit in racism unless we're actively working against dismantling that racism. And so I think that's what being an anti-racist is actually working internally and externally to break down the biases that exist internally, but then also working to break down the systems that exist in our lives, in our workplaces, in our institutions, in our governmental systems. And to me, that's what being an anti-racist is, in this binary of like, there are good people who are not racist, and then there are bad people who are racist, I think is really problematic, because it allows white people to sort of say, well, I'm not a part of the problem, so I don't have to participate in the change.
Anyone else?
Building on what Hannah said, the best metaphor I ever heard to help frame this is from Beverly Tatum, who wrote Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And she talks about racism as being a system that kind of moves people along a sliding sidewalk. And so somebody says, oh, I'm not, I don't do anything bad. They're still moving along. And she says the anti-racist is the person who turns around and walks the other way on this sliding sidewalk, that's taking action. And doing that at the airport will get you some experiences. But yeah, it's the unpacking of the stuff in yourself, taking action, working. If you're not making people angry, you're probably not doing it right.
I can appreciate that one.
And
Jack,
to highlight what Rob had said, action needs to be a part of that equation. So I think that's, if like you could be put into very simple terms, I think it would just be when action is a piece of it, when you are actively trying to stop something.
Reverend Bruner, do you want to add to that?
I don't think I need to. I think it's all great.
I love this idea, though, of being very intentional about it, right? And that is the piece, is that you have to be intentional about it. And then it seems to be also this idea of an ongoing process, This election has been very contentious. One survey showed 57% of white voters chose President Trump, especially people making over $100,000 a year, and older white men. I'd like for us to maybe take a moment to kind of analyze this. And Rob, let's start with you.
I think so much of the system is built around appealing to racial animosity, but also, I was just talking before we started about George Lipsett's book, The Possessive Investment in Whiteness. The idea that whiteness provides us with resources, access, and that people, as the United States is shifting to becoming a majority minority community, there is this reaction against that people fearing that they're going to lose. But I think it's an interesting thing. So I think about Florida, for instance, where what I think Trump won by about 3.5 points. But at the same time, a minimum wage law passed, that a $15 minimum wage law passed at 60% of the vote. And so, people that are disenfranchised, both people of color, white working class, the appeal to the white working class that, you're going to lose something if more, brown and black skinned people come to this country. You're going to lose something if a black man becomes president. That has to be countered by, no, we can all gain together if we look for program policies that provide equity, resources, insurance. So I think it's this fear. At least that's my sort of take on it, but I'm sure the other panelists have some clear ideas.
Yeah, to build up on the fear, it might be a fear of, what might happen to you in a physical way, but also a financial way, I think is probably one of the biggest parts of it. I had heard my uncle had mentioned to my mom, she was telling me that he works in Hollywood and the television industry, which is theoretically a very liberal leaning industry, but a lot of the wealthier people are going to be voting and did vote for Trump specifically because, they don't want to pay any more in taxes, and that's their only concern when it comes to their, personal well-being. That's what they would choose to protect.
Yeah, I think something interesting, I was looking the other day at some of the exit polls, and something that really surprised me was there was a question that was, do you believe that racism is the most important issue in America today? And then the second, so that was the one answer. The other answer was, you believe it's one of many issues in America today. And then there were, some lower, I don't believe it's an issue. And so as you can imagine, those who said, I believe it's the most important issue of the day, I think it was 30% of people, majority of those people did not vote for Trump. But in the second layer of it was 50% of people who said that they felt that racism was one of the many, but an important issue in America today. And 35% of those people voted for Donald Trump. And it was so interesting to me to see how can that be, right? Because you're saying that racism is an issue, yet you're voting for a man who has overtly, from calling that the only two Black people who have been on a presidential ticket in my lifetime, questioning their citizenship. You're calling, Black athletes who kneel, sons of, I don't know if we can say that on here. You won't denounce, a man who won't denounce white supremacy. Yet there are these people who voted for him, even saying that they believe that racism is an issue in America. And I think it goes back to that, maybe it's what Jackson was mentioning, that economic piece of it, voting for their economic interest. But that was just trying to unpack that and see how that disconnect can happen. Something I'm still thinking about.
I think there's also a piece about single issues, right? So probably a lot of folks are members of more conserving churches who are looking at the president's supposed stance on abortion, right? And that would have swayed their vote towards Trump, regardless of what he was saying about anybody else. So I think there's some of that happens with that too, and there's just a disconnect in media, right? What people are watching on television, the news that they're getting will certainly provide different information depending on which channel you're watching. So.
And the media, we've done a show on the media as it particularly relates to race, right? And so there are certainly some media outlets that associate race with a bunch of the fear mongering that also exists in much of the unfortunate politics of America. And I think that there's that connection there as well. And I think on some level, there's intentionality behind that too. So as anti-racists, are you all seeing any pushback from the election, and what do you think the future holds?
So I would just say I haven't received personally any pushback. I think there were a lot of people in the congregation I served, in fact, most of the people, I would say, that were relieved. But I think there's so much work that's right. This election is one thing, but there is so much work that will, as we move forward, and we don't have to move very much further than our own houses, because the state of Missouri made some decisions in this election that are really going to hurt people. And I think there's a lot of work for us to do in many ways to change some of those systems that will now be put in place. And I'm speaking of specifically about Amendment 3, and but how we've elected people in this state too. It's a very powerful group of people who sit in Jefferson City, and I think there's some concern there. So though we're maybe relieved about what happened at the federal level, there's still a lot of concern and work to get done on the ground here.
Yeah, I agree. There's still a lot of work to do, and right, these issues didn't just come up, with Trump, right? When the killing of Michael Brown and the protests, that wasn't during the Trump administration. So I think there's a lot of work to do, regardless of what happens. But I also think in terms of pushback, I'm not hearing a lot of pushback either in sort of my own world. But what is really interesting to me is instead I'm just hearing a lot of silence. And I think there's this, particularly among people that I know who probably voted for Trump. And I think, for me, that is almost worse than somebody being really loud and pushing back. I think there's this attitude of not wanting to talk about things, and this, we don't want to ruffle any feathers, and we don't want to have these conversations. And so that actually to me is concerning. But yeah, I'm just hearing a lot of nothing. There's a lot of silence.
For me, I want to ruffle feathers for sure. I had been living away from Webster Groves the last 7 years. I was most recently in Peru, and then March came around and I had to come back. So I was looking in Webster in a totally different way. But, it was a different environment than what I was used to. And I was just having to work through a lot of that. So I wanted to focus a lot on local issues. One of the things that actually we hosted a large gathering at Pastor Wendy's church in September. And I decided to write a short introduction for this event. So it was a speech that I wrote at the beginning, kind of talking about a lot of the specific issues that have plagued Webster Groves for a long time. Going back to when enslaved people were working on the land of, in Webster up until very recent events. So I had written this speech, but I actually got some pushback from my mother, which has been hard to reconcile. I know she's watching now, but it was really challenging because I know that she's very well-meaning and is also very, a liberal, hates Trump, all of this. But when I was recounting a lot of these things about Webster Groves, focusing on the local stuff, she felt that it was a bit of a personal attack. I'm choosing their way of life to, recognize that Webster is a racist place, and calling it out was hard to grapple with. But you put all the facts there, and I'm willing to have a conversation about it. I love Webster, but it's one of those things that I know that there would be pushback from it, and I'm okay with that.
Jackson, thanks for sharing such personal piece there in terms of your mom and that relationship. And we certainly know that this work, and when you step out into this work, you certainly have a lot at stake in terms of relationships. That being said, how do you actually break down this resistance that you might receive from well-intentioned white folks who say things like, I don't see color, or I treat everyone the same, or my family never owned slaves, or I'm not racist. I have, that Black friend. I have, fill in the blank. And, how do you respond to those things, statements?
Well, I'll just say, I think it depends really on how that conversation, like the context in which that conversation takes place, right? So if it's just a conversation where we're going to be speaking past one another, then I don't think there's a lot of, there's not a lot you can gain from that, because we're not listening to each other. I think if we're willing to sit down and talk about things, and I think one of the things that's really important, and Jackson, you mentioned some of it, and I think it happens to all of us, is that we take this so personally, right? And it's about systems and structures, right, in which we have really gained so much as a people, as a white people, right? But we take it very personally. And I think there's a step back that we need to encourage people to take. And I think doing some education, right, on like, let's talk about the history of this country, and let's talk about Social Security and how it became part of this country's fabric, and who gained from that and who didn't get anything from that. And those are the systems that we're built on. So it takes that kind of personal piece out of it and creates this opportunity for us to have a conversation. But if we're not willing to listen to one another, I think it's fruitless. There's no response,
Yeah, lovingly, I think was the how do you respond to that? And in a listening way, we used to teach a technique at the Anytown Youth Leadership Institute, which was developed by the Quakers, Lara. I think a lot of people use it, which is, you listen deeply, you affirm, and sometimes people are saying stuff that you can't agree with anything, but you affirm something like, I hear that you really feel that, you affirm that you really want to be on the side of racial justice, and then you add more you respond and add more information with an and so, but just, people, when they get listened to, when they're not dismissed, it has not worked well when I've called people, well, you're just being a racist, and that kind of shuts down a lot of avenues for building community with people.
Yeah, I think kind of tagging on to both of those, and that the way that white people get defensive, around issues of racism or being called a racist. I usually share that for me, like as a white person, one of the most liberating things was to realize that we are all racist and participate in a racist system, going back to what I was saying earlier. So it's not an attack on me personally, but just understanding that I'm going to do, even someone who is working to actively work against racism, I'm still going to do things and say things that are racist. And so I think, I always try to encourage white people to think of it sort of as the starting point, to sort of break down that defensiveness that comes.
To that point, I'm curious about being able to tell the difference between being genuine from performative wokeness. And I think, we are spending a lot of time these days, canceling people. We're talking about, white folks showing up on the streets in record numbers as performative. And, yet we see what the how folks voted, Hannah, as you pointed out, right? And so what's the difference between just this genuine wokeness and performative wokeness, and how do people of color make that distinction, or are able to make those distinctions?
Well, I would like to say this is where, at least for white people, should recognize the action part. Like, I think where it shouldn't be performative if you're actually demonstrating that you are trying to turn things around. There are many organizations, even St. Louis based, of course, across the country as well, that are actively trying to break down these barriers. And if you're spending your time or your resources, money, anything, trying to help the groups that already are trying to fight this, then that's not just performative wokeness. I mean, that's actually, trying to make a positive change. So something I started in June, volunteering with Faith and for the Sake of All. Wanted to make sure I gave them a quick shout out, because they're a group that's based on the For the Sake of All report that came out from Washington University. And they're trying to get faith leaders and Black churches throughout St. Louis area together to work with their communities. So right now they're mainly focused on providing free COVID testing at different Black churches throughout North City and North County. So I've been going usually once a week, sometimes twice a week, and we'll go and just help facilitate these COVID testing. They're also going to be working in some mental health resources that they can provide. And there's so many opportunities to be able to get involved. So Faith and for the Sake of All is one where I personally have done that.
Reverend Bruner?
I think it's, I think what Jackson said, I think you can go to a march and that's great. But going to a march is pretty easy because that takes you like your Saturday afternoon, right? Or maybe a lot of Saturday afternoons. I don't know how often people are out there marching. But and I don't think it's a bad idea. But I do think like what Jackson said, and I think I'm just going to widen that to systemic work, right? Like, how are we actually involved in our communities trying to change systems so that people can have better lives across the board, right? And if we're not doing that work, then going to a protest is just really a great way to spend our Sunday or Saturday afternoons. And so I think there's, and I don't want to judge people. I think it's great for people. It's a great way to start becoming involved, certainly. But there is a lot of work that needs to get done, and we sure need some more people to help. So
I would agree with both of those, and I would just also add that as if people are posting, because we know, like, right, a lot of people are posting on social media, Black Lives Matter, and I think this is also where a lot of that performative wokeness is happening. And I think also looking at like whose voices are being lifted up in that when people are posting, like, are you lifting up Black activists and Black people's voices, or are you centering your voice in that? And I would then also add that I think, are you, as someone who wants to make change, are you someone who's also open to criticism and willing to get feedback and be open to feedback, and then, make change and move forward in your work?
And kind of like what everybody else has said, I hate the term woke. How about waking? Because, kind of like what Hannah, I mean, we're constantly, when we try and do this stuff, the racism, the way we've been scripted, it's going to manifest itself. We need to be called out from time to time. It's a constant process of becoming. So it's not a place that you arrive. It's just a journey, and it's long work. It's, if you're in a union, you start asking questions about why are the apprentice cards going only to white folks, and who have parents who are in the union. Or if you're in a school and you say, starting to work on the issues of, well, how come there aren't that many children of color in algebra in 8th grade, and what are we doing and where are resources going? I mean, that's long slog work, and it's not sexy and it's not fun, and you can't post it on Facebook, but it's how the work gets done.
And that truly is the wokeness, right? Like, to the point in which you realize that it is beyond, and I appreciate what you said, Reverend Bruner, you know, protesting out on the streets is certainly a start. It's a great way, right? To on a Saturday afternoon, feel safe about this process, but there's deeper work to be done. And as you become more woke, that means you're starting to look at systems, and you're starting to question, and you're starting to notice things that just don't quite seem equitable, right? And you are willing to call that out and work towards finding the solution on that, right? So that you can begin to really create some anti-racist spaces. We asked folks as they registered to submit questions. And so I know we do have some questions that were pre-submitted, and I'm gonna ask Earl if he might have a question to toss to our panel.
Yes, I do. One question, just what we're talking about right now, is about that conversation aspect. But one thing that we really want to know is systematic racism needs to be recognized, and individuals need to be accountable for their attitudes and behaviors. Could you please speak to what accountability looks like in relationships with Trump voters who do not take responsibility for the harm they are perpetrating, for whom racism and misogyny are not deal breakers in their vote? How/should you stay in a relationship with accountability without canceling?
In that case, if the question of holding people that you know that were Trump voters accountable, I think using I voice helps a lot, so that you're, saying, I feel hurt that you're continuing to do this, I believe that this is contributing to something that is undermining the system. You don't have any formal authority over somebody, but you have personal authority. And when you say, I'm hurt, I have a hard time being with you when you're like this, that creates some accountability from a personal relationship standpoint.
Yeah, I think, it's tough, especially when you're talking about, potentially family or longtime friends. But I think continuing to address it and call it out and share your journey with them is really important. I think that I find too, not only in, if it's in a personal sphere, but also in other places that I exist, whether it be at work or somewhere that I volunteer, I've definitely thought about this a lot. And at what point when you bring something up or call it out, and then you don't feel like change is happening, like as a white person dealing with other white people, at what point do you pull away and stop? At what point do you give up trying to make change in that space? And for me, what I've come to is that I will, if I see that there is a door open and that there is an openness to hearing and change, then I will continue. If what I am doing is then making me complicit in the system because they aren't changing, then that is where I have to step away.
I want to shift for a quick moment around this idea of, and talk about allyship. And for all the work that white people are doing in the name of allyship, there are some who don't see it as sincere. I love your reaction to comedian Bill Burr's October 10th monologue on Saturday Night Live. It's a spoof about white suburban women getting involved in the racial justice movement. He said, quote, "Somehow white women swung their Gucci booted feet over the fence of oppression and stuck themselves at the front of the line. I don't know how they did it. I've never heard so much complaining in my life from white women," end quote. Is there any truth in that? And is that an unfair statement or offensive?
Well, comedians are offensive often, so there you go. But you know, one of the things that I would say about this as a white woman, you know, I'll just give you an example, right? So I remember when the Jason Stockley verdict came down, right? He shot Anthony Lamar Smith, and the verdict came down in 2017 in September. And I remember exactly where I was when I found out about the verdict and wanted to immediately, right, get down to wherever it was that I needed to be, which was downtown. You know, and then one of the things that happened out of that is that the group of people who were leading the organizing movement at that point, young Black folk, met with the pastors and said a couple of things. One, here's what we want you to do, and then we did it, and it was, please tell the people in your churches that we need them today, or that we need them tomorrow. It was on a Sunday, so I did that, right? Then when you go to those protests, right, it was like, okay, now we need the pastors in the front. Okay, so then so it's this idea of, I am not in charge here. And I don't know if that was what Bill Burr was trying to say in that monologue that he was doing, but I was not in charge. I was taking the lead from somebody else who was running the show, and I stood where they told me to stand, and I moved back when I needed to move back. And I think that's really difficult for white people. It doesn't matter if you're a woman or a man. You go in and you sort of want to be in charge, right? And so here, you know, I'm not a young woman anymore, and there were these young African American leaders who were telling me what to do, and you know, humility, just right, and you do it. And I think that's a bit of that's what I think about when I think about Bill Burr's statement, is that it's really hard to take a step back or to take a step up, whatever they tell you to do.
So I'd like to comment on Bill Burr as well, as a white woman. And what I actually heard that monologue and then went back and listened to it. And what I think was a really poignant, like the most poignant piece of that, and it's not in the quote that you read, but just after that, he's still talking about white women. And he talks about the ways that white women have been uniquely complicit in the system of racism. And how I think, you know, as a white woman and seeing how white women operate, in many cases, because we are women and we've also been oppressed, right? We feel like there should be like this allyship, because we also come from an oppressed group. And I think, you know, really though, looking and analyzing, and this is something I'm really starting to dig into a little bit in my identity as a white woman, is where white women have specifically created harm over the history of racism in America. So thinking about the way that white women have accused Black men of things that has caused harm and death to Black men, thinking all the way back to Emmett Till, right? A 14-year-old Black boy who a white woman said flirted with him and he was murdered, to thinking just back to this summer with Amy Cooper in Central Park and calling the police on Christian Cooper, who was a Black man bird watching in the park. And thinking about the way that women, you know, showed up, were activated when Trump was elected and showed up at these women's marches, but had not been very present in the Black Lives Movement matter in the same way. And how, you know, white women have, over the years, I mean, even like with education, right? And the integration of schools, we're fighting against the integration of schools. So I think that, I don't know if it answers the question about allyship, But I think that in order to be an ally as a white woman and to really show up and understand what I carry with me and my identity and what that history and legacy is to really think about the history of white women and racism and how we've been complicit so that we can then fight against that and be better allies for Black women and women of color.
I think that speaks to allyship, right? Like that is doing some soul searching, some reflecting, some ownership, and then being that much more intentional and informed in terms of, as you said, how you show up for Black women, how you show up for people of color, right? We think a lot about, there were statements even made about this election, right? And the ways in which Stacey Abrams and other Black women were able to compel Black women to show up and to vote. And we see how in many of the urban areas of these states that are being contested now, it was largely in part because of Black women showing up to vote, right? But yet we look again back, I mean, this is just amazing when you go back and you look at the demographics of voting, you look at those exit polls and you see how white women voted. And so how do you use your allyship, even as something as personal as that ballot box? Rob and Jackson, I want to ask you, actually, let me ask all of you all this question. This conversation is going really well. And I'm wondering if you all could afford me a little additional time beyond 8 o'clock. I understand if not, because that's what we asked. But if you're able to, I'd appreciate it, just so that we're getting more questions. I'm being texted and told we have other questions from our audience. And so I'd like that. So are you all good with that? Thank you, thank you. Rob and Jackson, I actually want to ask you all this question. Why have white men not become as involved as white women in the movement for racial equity? Or are they just less visible?
You want to go? Or, well, part of it is my people, white men. Part of it is a lack of awareness. Being white is kind of like being the fish in the water. You don't see it. And white men, when you add, cisgendered, heterosexual white men, middle class, part of it is not seeing it. And then a defensiveness, because it's like if you have all these layers of the onion that have built up the power, the prestige, the influence that you have in society, if you start peeling that back, there's this fear that, well, what do you mean I didn't work hard to get what I achieved? And yeah, you may have worked hard, but the reality is that you had some pretty major hookups with, nobody questioned your financial integrity when you went into a bank. Nobody questioned your ability to lead. And so all the different ways that when you start deconstructing success, it's a very scary thing to start peeling back that onion. And so very often, my experience in witnessing whiteness with groups, oftentimes there's not that many men to begin with. Oftentimes after about the third or fourth session, white men will drop out because to start stripping away some of the facade of what has helped you get where you are is kind of a scary proposition. When you do it though, your humanity emerges. And so there's a real benefit on the other side of that. But I don't know if Jackson, I wish I had an answer to this question because I'd like to see lots more of white men involved in the work.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like I mentioned in the beginning, growing up in Webster Groves on the south side of Lockwood, these issues were on the news. But really, until the last couple of years, I mean, I was probably thinking certain things or acting a way that I would find appalling now. One of the things I had mentioned in that speech I was talking about earlier at the Vigils to Action event with Pastor Wendy, I had mentioned how I was going and cleaning up some photos on my computer. And just going up through high school in Webster Groves, I had some things that I hadn't resolved because I just hadn't been having these conversations. So I was looking at my computer, cleaning up some photos, and I found a couple of memes that were a little bit racist. And I probably thought they were funny when I was growing up. So that, from somebody who thought they were liberal even, as somebody that just wasn't around these conversations at all, so it didn't affect me in any way. That's something I had to get over a period of years and looking to get over these issues. But in a lot of these spaces, I think that there's no imperative for white men to really need to do anything about it. And as Rob said, the risk is usually going to be greater, and there's just a lot of unknowns and it's uncomfortable. So why get uncomfortable when you don't need to?
Thanks. Earl, can you share a question from the audience?
Yes, I can. On the same topic, how about the process of being responsible for our education about history and today's reality? What is the most important task as a white person today?
I mean, I would say the most important task, I think there are many important tasks and things that we need to be doing in our lives, but I think speaking to white people and educating white people, other white people about racism, and we're really working to challenge perceptions and ideas and bring white people along.
You have another question, Earl?
Yes, I do. Hold on, give me 1 second here. The scrolling pages. All right. So this is a question directed to Reverend Pastor Bruner. United Churches of Christ are among Christian denominations known for embracing social justice issues. Yet you have said your church is not a quote activist church. Can you please explain?
Okay, so I'm not saying we're not doing the work. Here's what I'm saying. I'm saying that we're being the church. We're not being the activist church. We're being the church, right? So if we're followers of Jesus, right, which that's what a Christian is, then if we look at our text, it says, right, like the first reading that Jesus did in Luke's gospel in the 4th chapter, he pulled out Isaiah, the prophet, right? He's all about justice, and said that he was there, right, to liberate people, right? It was to bring the year of the Lord's favor, which is Jubilee, which means redistribution of wealth, right? And it's like taking the knee of the empire off the neck of the people, right? Like that is literally what he was about. If you take a look at Palm Sunday, was a march into Jerusalem during the Passover, which was celebrating the liberation of the Israelites out of Egypt, a very oppressive empire, right? He was doing that, and the people were saying to him, Hosanna, Hosanna, right? Which means save us, not save us for heaven, save us right now. We are dying here. And then he was crucified because he was considered treasonous to the empire, right? Like lots of people were crucified as because they were treasonous. It was an example for people so that they wouldn't do what Jesus did. So if that's who I'm following, then my actions must be those actions. And that means that's not being an activist. That means I'm being a Christian. I'm trying to be a follower of Jesus. And I think when we say we're an activist, if you say you're an activist church, it allows somebody else not to be that, doing that work. You know what I'm saying? It's like saying, well, we're an activist church and you're not. And another church might say, well, we don't have to do that because they're the activist church, right? And what I'm suggesting is We all must be that. It's just as simple as that. We're just trying to be the church. And I don't want to give anybody an out, really. Any other church an out.
I appreciate that. I want to acknowledge again that we are at the 8 o'clock hour. For those of our audience members who have to leave, we certainly understand. This panel will continue for another 15 minutes. If you are able to afford that time, we invite you to join us. Earl, do you have another question?
Yes, this question is for Ms. Hannah. People sometimes think racism is a solely Black-white issue and uniquely American when it's not. Hannah, as a director of a global program development at Webster, you engage with colleagues and partners from around the globe daily. From your perspective, what has been the global response to the Black Lives Matter movement?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, so definitely, America has a unique racism that exists, but certainly racism exists around the globe, and particularly when we think of the legacy of colonization, looking at Western Europe. And we can even see examples, I would say, in Europe, and thinking about the anti-immigrant sentiment that has really happened after the migration and the crisis in 2015. And you think about, like, what was Brexit a response to? Brexit was partly a response to that. So yes, racism exists around the globe. And in terms of response, I mean, we saw protests after, think about this summer, after the killing of George Floyd and all the protests that, were happening in the US. And we saw protests emerge around the globe, tons in Europe, big protests. And I think that those were occurring not only just in support of the movement happening in the US, but also people protesting the systems, the racist systems that exist in their countries as well. So we definitely saw a lot of activity and action and protest around the Black Lives Matter movement around the world. And, Webster has campuses abroad, and many of our campuses held talks and panels. I remember specifically, we have a campus in the Netherlands, and I listened to a panel that they had around the Black Lives Matter movement. And that session really allowed space for their staff, faculty, and students of color to really share their experiences. And hearing their experiences, very similar experiences happening in the Netherlands that are happening in the US, so.
Thank you. I had a similar conversation in South Africa, and to hear, and those around race and media, and very much the same experiences seem to be there, resonating there. Jackson, you've done a lot of global traveling. Might you have a perspective on that as well?
Yeah, actually, that's one thing I wanted to highlight is, while the United States has had a unique history of racism, I personally have traveled in some amount of time between 52 countries within 2,000 US counties almost as well. But I've also learned that racism exists pretty much everywhere. I was at a master's degree. I was studying in China, and I lived there for 1 year. I was supposed to be back in March, but things happen. And in this is a very unique situation I was in. I was living on campus because I had a scholarship there, but all of the Chinese students were segregated from the international students. So the international students mostly were living together. Enrolled in the university, there were 4,000 of us from 120 different countries. So many of the different countries, there were more than 50 people from, but at the same time, a lot of those issues from back home were just projected on a micro level between a lot of the students. Like for instance, the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon, which is going on now, that was the largest country where people were from at this university, about 350 or so students. But a lot of the English-speaking Cameroonian students weren't talking with the French-speaking Cameroonian students. In many other instances, that goes across the board. But I even experienced some subtle acts of racism, or at least awareness of who I was and that I wasn't a Chinese person when I would be out in the community. People took photos of me, you know, to just be sitting in the cafeteria or walking down the street or in the subway or something. And I just see someone wanting to take a photo of me or just filming me and not asking. I'd know people would be talking about me, and I'd hear from a friend what they were saying or something like that. I was told I looked ugly because I looked like someone from Xinjiang, which is the Muslim region in China, and there's a lot of animosity against Muslim people currently in China, even saying that the people look ugly there. And like the most frustrating thing that I experienced was I was with a number of friends and we were having a barbecue in a public park, and then a bunch of older people living around, you know, were kind of surprised to see people gathered and you know, cooking some meat, even though people do that all the time. But it was mostly people from Africa that were in my group. And the police came and they told us to leave. They, you know, put out our fire and then we had to go away. But on another part of that, I've also benefited a little bit from this. I was able to get teaching jobs in, you know, in like the after school English teaching or even in elementary schools. Even though I have no formal certification that I can be a teacher, I'm just a white person. Same with the Ukrainian and Russian people, they were able to get teaching jobs, but some of my African friends couldn't, even if they're native English speakers. Like one of my friends, he was from Liberia, and he was able to find work in a chair factory, but like under the visa, it wasn't allowed. So he was able to just, you know, get exploited, work really hard hours, but not get paid very much for it. So racism exists everywhere. In China, there's a lot of similarities because there's, you know, one major ethnic group, and I didn't know what it was like, you know, until that happened. But I saw it in little pieces here and there, a lot of others I didn't mention, and that really kind of made me understand a little more about, you know, how it feels, and it doesn't feel good.
About that white privilege, right? Like that is white privilege right there, even outside of the United States. I'd like to ask you all this question. I want to start off with you, Rob. The Black activists that we've talked to on this show speak of a fatigue that they feel in performing this work. Things like protesting again and again and again, but not really seeing any systemic results. Do you all experience that fatigue, and how do you handle it?
Nothing close to what Black activists experience. There's, you know, I can go to a protest, I can be at, when I was working, trying to work on systems, and I get to drive home as a little white boy and go into my house and not have the everyday presence of that around. So anytime I get tired or feel sorry for myself, I just say, shut up, because whatever fatigue I might experience, it's nothing in comparison.
Great answer. Anyone else have any other thoughts there?
I did have a small point. You know, in some cases, you know, I've heard people say, I think this is really where it should be reminded that it's a marathon and not a sprint. That's something I hear almost every protest I go to. Reverend Daryl Gray has said that quite a few times, as well as some other activists. But what I've seen, at least as far as specifically for white people at the protests and facing fatigue. I have seen in instances where there's been, serious police presence these last months, mainly in St. Charles and in Florissant. The goal of the officers has been to discourage or, deliberately target people to make them uncomfortable and feel unsafe to go back. Tony Messenger in the Post-Dispatch recently highlighted a really rough case where there's a couple that brought their kids to an event I was at in St. Charles, and they got charged with something like child endangerment, or that was at least a threat of theirs. And then in the case of my dad and I have been going to a lot of these protests together, but he was arrested in Florissant back in July. There were 18 people that were arrested, 17 of them were white. And the experience was just totally uncomfortable for them. Like, they were there for 15 hours, not given any water. And someone asked for water, they were in pain because, they had pepper spray in their eyes, and the officers like flicks water from a water bottle at them. They, wake them up at 4 a.m. after they're finally able to go to sleep. They took my dad to a hospital even though he refused care, and then he ended up with a $500 bill. After 13 hours, they turned on the TVs and had the food channel on, even though they didn't get food or water during this time. But at least for my dad, he's 59 years old, it only strengthened his resolve. For some other people, I think they got discouraged by that.
And I find that interesting, right? And so you said 18 people, 17 were white. And, I guess one could question, were the white officers trying to scare the white folks from showing up at the protest, right? Don't do this again. But the reality of it also so often is actually that there's so many more Black folks who are arrested, who are detained for those same actions of protest, right? And bail bondsmen and all of those things just don't work out still for them. And again, because they are Black. As we wrap up, and Chancellor Strobel is going to join us in a moment, I'm wondering if you all are able to share some resources that audience can explore along their own journeys, right? What are some resources that you think that have been good? Rob, I've heard you talk of NCCJ, I've heard you talk of Witnessing Whiteness. Are there other ones out there?
So Peace is involved with Metropolitan Congregations United, which is an faith-based organizing group. Is part of a national group called Gamaliel. And that's a really great place for people to come and learn about the issues and connect with things that they're passionate about. So I would encourage people to check that out, Metropolitan Congregations United. That would be a great resource for folks.
And I wanted to highlight one more time the organization I've been volunteering with these last months, Faith and for the Sake of All. So you can go to faithandforthesakeofall.org, and you'll be able to find more information about them. They're always looking for some financial contributions, but they're really, really doing a good job just about working in the community and connecting people to resources. So that's an organization that I'm really proud to be a part of.
I mean, there are so many. I say do your research and get plugged into what connects with you. For me, some organizations, Action St. Louis is an organization here that organizes politically to build Black political power. I really get behind supporting them. But you can find lists, especially after the killing of George Floyd, on Instagram, of books to read, of movies to watch, read Black authors, follow Black activists. I think there's just so much information out there, and as white people, it's easy to have to be like, oh, well, we don't know where to go, or we don't know what to do. And there's so much information out there and so many resources out there. I'm happy if somebody's interested to like give you a list, but instead of listing them all off here, I'd say go out and do your research and find what connects to you.
Thank you. Did I steal your thunder, Rob?
I was muted. I mean, two of those organizations. There's also the Antiracist collective in St. Louis. And like Hannah said, just a quick Google search and you will find lots.
Thank you. We're going to bring up Chancellor Strobel for her closing remarks and her summation of tonight's conversation. I thank you all for joining me tonight. And here's Chancellor Strobel, Dr. Strobel.
Oh, well, thank you. I am so grateful to be colleagues with Vincent and Earl. Each one of these just gives us new insights and new opportunity to reflect. And tonight's particularly, as you each responded to that first question about where did your journey start? That, of course, causes me to start thinking about, well, where did my journey start down the path of trying to be the person that I want to be, not only for myself, but my community and my world. And sometimes it is the experiences and the partners and the teams we're part of. Sometimes it's the geography, where we have opportunity to live and what our experiences are from that. But what I want to say is that we need each other. Not only do we need to be allies and anti-racist for the benefit of those who have barriers in their way, we need each other to keep us straight and on the path of the journey, because it's not like you kind of get there, as Rob said, it's a process. But to be honest, it's not like I stayed on the path and was true to it through all these years, or even still am today. It's easy to kind of lapse back into those things that you learned as a member of a system that gave you advantages that other people didn't have. And so it seems to me that this process of learning is a process of having yourself revealed to yourself. As an individual, you become more self-aware, and you become more self-aware of how, as a member of a family and a community and an organization and a society, a nation, a world, how human interaction with other humans is often destructive. And we've really been focusing on the issue of race. But as Hannah says, you could slice and dice this lots of different ways, how humans are not necessarily people of compassion to one another. And so Wendy, as our down the street neighbor, I want to thank you for your encouragement that we kind of anchor our principles and how we think about this in whatever our identity is. And as a Christian, that gives us one point of view, but there are many points of view you could anchor your beliefs in. And that's why I say we need each other. We need a community where there's a Webster Speaks, where there's a congregation, where there's an action group, where there's an organization, where there's a university we're part of, whatever it is, that helps us keep learning and revealing how this works, and to bring our better selves to the surface, to try to help our better human instincts and a sense of compassion and empathy not only be aware of those barriers, but to be party to removing them for each other. Because those barriers harm all of us. they harm Black people in a very particular way, in a way that we shouldn't want for anyone. They truly do hurt all of us when some of us are hurt. And I really applaud your willingness to talk about your own journey and how you're putting your principles into action. It is about action. It isn't enough to not be the person erecting the barriers, although that's difficult to really be honest with yourself and say, I haven't put barriers in other people's way. But it's more than that. It's removing the barriers so that there is equitable success and excellence and success for everybody. And that's what this whole series from week 1 to week 10 has been about. And you have all helped us see that in a new way. And I thank Earl and Vincent for inviting you. I thank you for being the panelists that you are tonight. And I'm glad that you are our colleagues, even just for tonight, and I hope into the future. So again, thank you very much. I'm always glad to be part of these and to gain the insights that you give me as I'm reflecting and thinking alongside with you. You are great role models for every single one of us, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Strobel. So glad to be a colleague of yours in this work as well. We want to thank our guests again for appearing tonight. Jackson, Reverend Wendy, Hannah, and Rob. Webster Speaks will be back at 7 p.m. Central Time on December 2nd when we talk with experts who are leading workplace diversity. Our guest will be Angela Cody, who is the Director of Inclusion and Diversity Leader of the St. Louis Diversity and Inclusion Consortium. Desiree Coleman, who is a Diversity and Inclusion Executive at a Fortune 50 company and founder of the Women's Empowerment and Wellness Program, The Queen Within. And then Clinton Normore, who is the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at A.T. Still University, and a good friend of the university's Valerie Patton, Senior Vice President of Inclusion and Workforce Development Strategies, and the Executive Director of the St. Louis Business Diversity Initiative. Again, thank you all for joining us. Be safe and good night.